Good day everyone, this is Ma'am Jo, and for this week's MTSem, we would be discussing antibacterial mechanisms of action and bacterial resistance mechanisms. For our learning objectives, these are to describe the mechanism of action of the different classes of antibacterial agents, discuss the mechanisms used by microorganisms to disseminate resistant determinants, and to discuss how antibiotic stewardship can preserve the effectiveness of antibiotics. Let's start off with the definition of your antimicrobial agents. These have the capacity to kill or suppress the growth of your microorganisms. Another definition is that these are agents that can destroy microorganisms through inhibiting their development or pathogenic action. Examples of these agents are your antibacterials, antifungals, antiseptics, sterilant, and disinfectants. Now you have two types of antimicrobials based on its mode of action. You have your bactericidal agents and your bacteriostatic agents. When you say bactericidal agents, from the name itself, it is an agent that can kill the microbe, resulting in cell lysis. Examples are your penicillin, vancomycin, and cephalosporins. That is why after taking the drug that is a bactericidal agent, there would be a lysis of your microorganisms. So after na take, nawawalan na yung microorganisms nyo due to cell lysis. On the other hand, when we say bacteriostatic agents, this inhibits the growth of the microorganism and relies on the host's cellular and humoral immune system to be able to kill the microorganism. Examples are your tetracyclines, sulfonamides, and your erythromycin. That's why kapag sinabi nating bacteriostatic agents, once you have taken the drug na bacteriostatic agent ang kanyang mode of action, it only leads the bacteria's stage on its stationary growth. So, meaning to say, it only stops the growth of the bacteria. Pero once after, hindi nyo na tinake yung drug, it would continue to increase its growth into the host. Unless the host immune system is able to kill off the microorganism during its stationary phase. We also have two types of antimicrobial agents based on its spectrum. You have your narrow spectrum antibiotics and your broad spectrum antibiotics. When we say narrow spectrum, from the name itself, narrow lang siya or limited lang yung kanyang spectrum of action. Example is your penicillin G. Your penicillin G is primarily effective only against gram-positive bacteria. So meaning, dun lang siya pwedeng gamitin as antibiotics. On the other hand, when we say broad-spectrum antibiotics, from the name itself, it can act against an extensive range of disease-causing bacteria by targeting both gram-positive and gram-negative bacterial groups. Now, how do we define the term antibiotics? These are compounds that are naturally produced by living microorganisms such as bacteria and fungi. These are also chemical substances produced by microorganisms that inhibits the growth of other microorganisms. Your antibiotics may be present as natural, semi-synthetic, or synthetic products. Now, your antibiotics can be categorized into several types. You have your beta-lactams antibiotics, your antibiotics that alter bacterial cell membranes, and antibiotics that inhibit protein synthesis, and lastly, your sulfonamides, quinolones, and other antibiotics not classified. We'll be discussing each of the categories. Let's start off with your beta-lactams. From the name itself, these are antibiotics that contain your beta-lactam ring. Now, its mode of activity is that it can be able to inhibit the cell wall synthesis by inhibition of enzymes needed by the microorganism's formation of its wall, specifically your peptidoglycan. Now, one of the disadvantages in the usage of beta-lactam antibiotics is that generally 10% of the population is hypersensitive or allergic to penicillin, which is an example of your beta-lactam antibiotic. Now you have different categories of your beta-lactam antibiotics, one of which is your penicillin, which can be seen as natural, penicillinase resistant, and extended spectrum. When we say natural penicillin, its main source is from the mold of your Penicillium notatum. Now, its spectrum covers all gram-positive microorganisms aside from your Staphylococcus species. It's mainly used in the treatment of your Streptococcus infections since most of the Staphylococcus species are resistant to natural penicillin. When we say penicillinase-resistant penicillins, its spectrum covers gram-positive microorganisms, including your Streptococcus and methicillin-susceptible Staphylococcus aureus. It is active against penicillinase-producing Staphylococcus, although there is increased resistance to some of these agents. Examples of your penicillinase-resistant penicillins are your methicillin, nafcillin, oxacillin, closaxilin, and diclosaxilin. And lastly, when we say extended spectrum penicillins, these are chemically modified and semi-synthetic. Examples of these extended spectrum penicillins are your aminopenicillins, carboxypenicillins, and your aceclaminopenicillins. Next category under your beta-lactam antibiotics are your cephalosporin generations. Its main source is from the fungus Acremonium, which is from its metabolic byproducts. This is structurally similar to your penicillin but has a better withstand with the action of your beta-lactamase and is more modifiable. Now, your cephalosporins currently has 5 generations. We have your first, second, third, fourth, and fifth generation. Nung student ako hanggang 4th generation lang. Ayan. Ngayon, hanggang 5th na siya. So, meaning to say, our antibiotics are also evolving as our microorganisms are also evolving. Okay? So, what I need you to remember are the antibiotics under or classified under each generations. So, kindly please remember this first column and then also take note of their mode of action. Next category under the beta-lactam antibiotics are your monobactams, which is commonly known as your Astreonam in the market. This is originally made from Chromobacterium violacum, which is now produced from a synthetic source. Now, its spectrum covers Pseudomonas aeruginosa and other gram-negative bacteria. It has a low activity against gram-positive bacteria and anaerobes. Next, we have your carbapenems. Examples of your carbapenems are your imipenem, meropenem, doripenem, and ertapenem. Its spectrum covers the activity similar to your third generation cephalosporins, with slightly greater activity towards your Enterobacteriaceae species and Pseudomonas aeruginosa and other anaerobes. And the last classification under beta-lactams are your glycopeptides. The most common glycopeptides are your vancomycin, which was isolated in the year 1953 by Edmund Cornfield. Now, this compound was originally named as compound 05865, but later was given the name vancomycin derived from the term vanquish. Now, for the mode of activity of the glycopeptides, it is able to inhibit cell wall formation through inhibition of peptidoglycan synthesis, which interferes with cross-linking peptidoglycan chains. Now, for its spectrum, it covers gram-positive microorganisms and is mainly used for methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus or MRSA, and nosocomial infections from coagulase-negative Staphylococcus. Aside from the beta-lactams, we have the antibiotics that alter bacterial cell membranes. These bind to outer surface of cell membrane and alter phospholipids, which damage and disrupt the cell membrane, causing increased permeability and leakage. Antibiotics under this category are your bacitracin and your polymyxins B and E, more commonly known as your colistin. Now, for bacitracin, its main source is from the bacteria Bacillus licheniformis. It is usually used as a topical agent for skin and mucous membrane infections, cuts, burns, and ear and eye infections. It's primarily used in the treatment of gram-positive microorganisms, including your Staphylococcus and some gram-negative infections also. While your polymyxins B and E, again commonly known as your colistin, covers your gram-negative microorganisms and is also used as a topical agent in combination with other antibiotics to treat skin, burns, and wound infections. So, tatandaan si bacitracin usually for positive microorganism, si polymyxin usually for gram-negative microorganisms. Next category are antibiotics that inhibit the protein synthesis. We have aminoglycosides, tetracyclines, macrolides and lincosamides, and chloramphenicol. For aminoglycosides, its mode of activity is that it interferes with the protein synthesis at the 30S ribosomal subunit, which prevents translation of your messenger RNA. Examples of antibiotics under aminoglycosides are the following. Next, we have your tetracyclines. Its mode of activity is it interferes with protein synthesis at 30S ribosomal subunit, which prevents the transfer RNA from attachment. Examples of the antibiotics under tetracyclines are the following. Next, we have your macrolides and lincosamides. Its mode of activity is it inhibits protein synthesis by binding to 50S ribosomal subunit, inhibiting now the transfer RNA. Ito siya. Antibiotics under this classification are the following. And the last antibiotic under this category is your chloramphenicol. Its mode of activity is that it interferes with protein synthesis by binding to 50S ribosomal subunit, preventing attachment of the amino acids and the formation of peptide bonds. It has activity against many gram-positive and gram-negative infections. However, because of serious side effects and the availability of the other, safer antibiotics, its use has been much diminished and usually reserved for serious gram-negative infections only, such as typhoid fever and salmonellosis. And yung serious side effect niya is that it causes bone marrow aplasia. The last category under antibiotics are your sulfonamides, quinolones, and other antibiotics. For sulfonamides, this has a competitive inhibition of folic acid synthesis. For quinolones, this inhibits the DNA's gyrase activity, which interferes with the synthesis of your DNA. Third one, your nitrofurantoin, has the inhibition of bacterial enzymes or the protein synthesis itself. Your rifampin is also a anti-mycobacterial agent which inhibits DNA-dependent ribonucleic acid polymerase. And lastly, you have your metronidazole. This is a reduction of products of metronidazole causing your altered DNA synthesis, which results to bactericidal effect. This is activated under anaerobic conditions, which makes it useful for the treatment of most anaerobes. Next category are your antimicrobial agents. These are multiple drugs that are used to minimize the incidence of your drug-resistant Mycobacterium tuberculosis. Some of these agents function by inhibiting the mycolic acid formation in the cell wall, whereas others inhibit the DNA-dependent RNA polymerase. The following are the drugs used or under this category. Kindly please remember the acronym RIPES, which stands for rifampin, isoniazid, pyrazinamide, ethambutol, and streptomycin. For rifampin, this inhibits the DNA-dependent RNA polymerase. For isoniazid, its function is it interferes with the formation of mycolic acid in the wall of mycobacteria. For pyrazinamide and ethambutol, both of them function as a bactericidal and bacteriostatic agent respectively. And lastly, we have your streptomycin, which is an aminoglycoside and generally used as a second-line drug in the treatment of tuberculosis. Here in the Philippines, currently, we have the National Tuberculosis Control Program or the NTCP, which was established in the year 1978 and operates together with the Department of Health and the Disease Prevention and Control Bureau. Currently, in the year 2023, we have a total of 3,332 TB treatment facilities all over the country. This promotes the decreased mortality and morbidity rate of tuberculosis. In TB dots, ang nangyayari is, yung pasyenteng may tuberculosis is pumupunta diretso sa RHU unit na pinakamalapit sa kanya. Tapos doon inaabot yung gamot na kailangan niyang i-take. Usually, this takes 3 to 6 months. Ginagawa to kasi dati, inuuwi ng mga pasyente yung gamot for the treatment. However, minsan kasi nakakaligtaan nilang i-take yung mga gamot na to. And take note guys, multiple drugs yung mga iniinom nila. So, dapat kailangan tinitake sila ng sabay-sabay. However, since there are some patients na hindi naman natin maiwasan na nakakalimutan nilang i-take yung gamot na to in this specific day, ganun. So, ang nangyayari is nagkakaroon tayo ng drug-resistant tuberculosis. Kaya nagkaroon tayo ngayon ng TB dots or the tutok gamutan for tuberculosis. Aside from your antibacterial and antimicrobial agents, we also have your antifungal agents. I would only be mentioning some of the most common antifungal agents that we use currently at present. The first one we have is your amphotericin B. This attacks sterols in the fungal cell wall, especially your ergosterols, which alters now the cell membrane of your yeast, and usually used in treatment of Cryptococcus and Candida infections. Next, we have your imidazole, your clotrimazole, your ketoconazole, and your miconazole. These four are usually seen as a topical agent or yung pinapahid sa mga balat natin because it's used in the treatment of dermatophytic, yeast, and superficial fungal infections. And lastly, we have your nystatin. This binds to ergosterol in the fungal cell membrane. The main source of your nystatin is your Streptomyces norsei. This is also used as an ointment or topical agent. Next agents are your antivirals. I would only be mentioning drugs under HIV influenza A and B viruses, and hepatitis B virus. First one, we have your drugs under HIV treatment. You have your nevirapine, your saquinavir, and your enfuvirtide. Next, the drugs under the treatment of influenza A and B are your oseltamivir, which is commonly known as your Tamiflu, and your zanamivir. Both your oseltamivir and zanamivir are neuraminidase inhibitors. And lastly, under the treatment for hepatitis B virus, you have your lamivudine and your adefovir dipivoxil, or mas common siya as adefovir. Now, so much on the mechanism of actions and the types of antimicrobial agents. Let's now move on and discuss the two types of resistance of antimicrobial agents. You have your intrinsic and your acquired resistance. When we say intrinsic or inherent resistance, this means that it is a natural resistance of the bacteria to the antibiotic. Examples are your Staphylococcus saprophyticus, which is resistant to novobiocin, your PPME or your Proteus providentia, Morganella, and Edwardshella species. These are resistant to polymyxins. And lastly, your Pseudomonas aeruginosa is, as we all know, resistant to your SXD or your trimethoprim sulfamethoxazole. So, pag sinabing inherent resistance, ever since na buo itong microorganism na to, resistant na siya sa antibiotic na yon. Okay? The next one, when we say acquired resistance naman, from the name itself, this is a result after the exposure of the microorganism to the antimicrobial agent. Ito yung nangyayari kapag nagtitake tayo ng antibiotics na hindi naman required for treating or treatment of that microorganism. That is why this leads to chromosomal mutations and leads to antimicrobial resistance. So when we say antimicrobial resistance or simply AMR, this is due to the misuse and overuse of your antimicrobials, which are the main drivers in the development of the drug-resistant pathogens. Now, the World Health Organization has declared AMR as one of the top 10 global public health threats facing humanity, and it also requires urgent multi-sectoral action in order to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. That is why we are now promoting the antibiotic stewardship, which refers to the appropriate use of antimicrobials to maximize their current effects and improve the chances of their being available for future generations. So, di ba remember, if you can recall, dati, madali lang nating nabibili yung mga antibiotics sa mga pharmacies. Pero ngayon, since we have now the antimicrobial resistance as one of the public threats, we are now promoting antibiotic stewardship. And one of which is yung kailangan prescribe yung mga antibiotics na binibili natin sa pharmacy. Now, here in the Philippines, we are having the National Antimicrobial Stewardship or AMS program under the Department of Health and also the World Health Organization Philippines. This is a concerted implementation of systematic, multidisciplinary, multi-pronged interventions in both public and private hospitals in the Philippines to be able to improve the appropriate use of antimicrobials. So, usually, every year to ginagawa and usually done every November of every year. So, in this program, we are having the Resistance Awareness Week and also the Antimicrobial Resistance Campaigns and Advocacies. Currently, there are pathogens that needs to be reported under the National Antimicrobial Resistance Surveillance Program, and these are the following pathogens. So, once may mga gantong presence sa mga public hospitals and also private hospitals, nare-report to diretso sa DOH. And lastly, in accordance with the promotion of antibiotic stewardship, you should comply with the 4Ds of optimal antimicrobial therapy, which are the 4Ds. The 4Ds stands for right drug, right dose, de-escalation or right delivery to pathogen-directed therapy, and the right duration of therapy. These are the references that I've used for this week's MTSem. Remember, fight antibiotic resistance, think twice, seek advice, and antibiotics aren't always the answer. Thank you for listening.